大家好啊！讀你聽2.0嘅時間，今日咧就繼續讀 A.Christie 嘅 Sparkling Cyanide 嚟到第2章啦。咁啊上一回咧就係講Iris 貓啦，咁啊仲有就佢姐姐咧 Rosemary 啦咁樣，佢哋兩姊妹嘅關係啦，佢嘅性格啦、際遇啦，同埋 Rosemary 嘅死啦，仲有章就係 Rosemary 佢死當日同佢同台食飯嘅所有人都列晒出嚟啦，有7位人士。咁就原本以為 Rosemary 係死於自然嘅，咁點知咧就有人寫匿名信俾佢哋咧，就話俾佢哋知 Rosemary 咧係謀殺死嘅。咁啊第2章就講呢個 Ruth Lessing。咁 Ruth Lessing 嘅邊個咧？就係當然就係當晚 Rosemary 死嘅座上客嘅其中之一位啦。而呢個 Ruth Lessing 咧 ，OK 係一個非常之能幹嘅人物嚟嘅。無論係 Iris 啦、Rosemary 啦，或者係 Rosemary 嘅丈夫啦，佢哋個個咧都好信任呢個 Ruth Lessing 嘅，覺得佢好能幹嘅，萬能秘書嚟嘅。咁咧呢一章咧就講 Ruth Lessing 啦，睇下 Ruth Lessing 嘅故事係咩 ？Ruth Lessing, during a momentary lull in her busy day, was remembering her employer's wife, Rosemary Barton. She had disliked Rosemary Barton a good deal. She had never known quite how much until that November morning when she had first talked with Victor Drake. The interview with Victor had been the beginning of it all, had set the whole train in motion. Before then, the things she had felt and thought had been so far below the stream of her consciousness that she hadn't really known about them. She was devoted to George Barton. She always had been. When she had first come to him, a cool, competent young woman of 23, she had seen that he needed taking charge of. She had taken charge of him. She had saved him time, money, and worry. She had chosen his friends for him and directed him to suitable hobbies. She had restrained him from ill-advised business adventures and encouraged him to take judicious risks on occasions. Never once in their long association had George suspected of her of being anything other than subservient, attentive, and entirely directed by himself. He took a distinct pleasure in her appearance, the neat, shining dark head, the smart tailor-mades and crisp shirts, the small pearls in her well-shaped ears, the pale, discreetly powdered face, and the faint, restrained rose shade of her lipstick. Ruth, he felt, was absolutely right. He liked her detached, impersonal manner, her complete absence of sentiment or familiarity. In consequence, he talked to her a good deal about his private affairs, and she listened sympathetically and always put in a useful word of advice. She had nothing to do, however, with his marriage. She did not like it. However, she accepted it and was invaluable in helping with the wedding arrangements, relieving Mrs. Mao of a great deal of work. For a time after the marriage, Ruth was on slightly less confidential terms with her employer. She confined herself strictly to the office affairs. George left a good deal in her hands. Nevertheless, such was her efficiency that Rosemary soon found that George's Miss Lessing was an invaluable aid in all sorts of ways. Miss Lessing was always pleasant, smiling, and polite. George, Rosemary, and Iris all called her Ruth, and she often came to Elphiston Square to lunch. She was now 29 and looked exactly the same as she had looked at 23. Without an intimate word ever passing between them, she was always perfectly aware of George's slightest emotional reactions. She knew when the first elation of his married life passed into an ecstatic content. She was aware when the content gave way to something else that was not so easy to define. A certain inattention to detail shown by him at this time was corrected by her own forethought. However distrait George may be, Ruth Lessing never seemed to be aware of it. He was grateful to her for that. It was on the November morning that he spoke to her of Victor Drake. "I want you to do a rather unpleasant job for me, Ruth." She looked at him inquiringly. No need to say that certainly she would do it. That was understood. "Every family's got a black sheep," said George. She nodded comprehendingly. This is a cousin of my wife's, a thorough bad hat, I'm afraid. He's half ruined his mother, a fatuous, sentimental soul who has sold out most of what few shares she has on his behalf. He started by forging a check at Oxford. They got that hushed up, and since then he's been shipped about the world, never making good anywhere. Ruth listened without much interest. She was familiar with the type. They grew oranges, started chicken farms, went as jackeroos to Australian stations, got jobs with meat freezing concerns in New Zealand. They never made good, never stayed anywhere long, and invariably got through any money that had been invested on their behalf. They had never interested her much. She preferred success. He's turned up now in London, and I find he's been worrying my wife. She hadn't set eyes on him since he was a schoolgirl, but he's a plausible sort of scoundrel, and he's been writing to her for money. And I'm not going to stand for that. I've made an appointment with him for 12 o'clock this morning at his hotel. I want you to deal with it for me. The fact is, I don't want to get into contact with that fellow. I've never met him, and I never want to, and I don't want Rosemary to meet him. I think the whole thing can be kept absolutely businesslike if it's fixed up through a third party. Yes, that is always a good plan. What is the arrangement to be? £100 cash and ticket to Buenos Aires. The money to be given to him actually on board the boat. Ruth smiled. Quite so. You want to be sure he actually sails. I see you understand. That's not an uncommon case, she said indifferently. No, plenty of that type about, he hesitated. Are you sure you don't mind doing this? Of course not. She was a little amused. I can assure you I'm quite capable of dealing with the matter. You're capable of anything. What about booking his passage? What's his name, by the way? Victor Drake. The ticket's here. I rang up the steamship company yesterday. It's a San Cristobal. Sails from Tilbury tomorrow. Ruth took the ticket, glanced over it to make sure of its correctness, and put it into her handbag. That's settled. I'll see to it. 12 o'clock. What address? The Rupert of Russell Square. She made a note of it. Ruth, my dear, I don't know what I should do without you. He put a hand on her shoulder affectionately. It was the first time he had ever done such a thing. You're my right hand, my other self. She flushed, pleased. I've never been able to say much. I've taken all you do for granted, but it's not really like that. You don't know how much I rely on you for everything, he repeated. Everything. You're the kindest, dearest, most helpful girl in the world. Ruth said, laughed to hide her pleasure and embarrassment. You spoil me saying such nice things. Oh, but I mean them. You're a part of the firm, Ruth. Life without you would be unthinkable. She ran out feeling a warm glow in his words. It was still with her when she arrived at the Rupert Hotel on her errand. Ruth felt no embarrassment at what lay before her. She was quite confident of her powers to deal with any situation. Hard love stories and people never appealed to her. She was prepared to take Victor Drake as all in a day's work. He was very much as she had pictured him, though perhaps definitely more attractive. She made no mistake in her estimate of his character. There was not much good in Victor Drake. As cold-hearted and calculating a personality as could exist, well masked behind an agreeable devilry. What she had not allowed for was his power of reading other people's souls, and a practiced ease with which he could play on the emotions. Perhaps, too, she had underestimated her own resistance to his charm, for he had charm. He greeted her with an air of delighted surprise. George's emissary? But how wonderful! What a surprise! In dry, even tones, she set out George's terms. Victor agreed to them in the most amiable manner. £100? Not bad at all. Poor old George. I have taken 60, but don't tell him so. Conditions. Do not worry lovely cousin Rosemary. Do not contaminate innocent cousin Iris. Do not embarrass worthy cousin George. All agreed to. Who is going to see me off on the San Cristobal? You are, my dear Miss Lessing. Delightful. He wrinkled up his nose. His dark eyes twinkled sympathetically. He had a lean brown face, and there was a suggestion about him of a toreador, romantic conception. He was attractive to women and knew it. You've been with Barton some time, haven't you, Miss Lessing? 6 years. And he wouldn't know what to do without you. Oh, yes, I know all about it. And I know all about you, Miss Lessing. How do you know? Asked Ruth sharply. Victor grinned. Rosemary told me. Rosemary? But that's all right. I don't propose to worry Rosemary any further. She's already been very nice to me. Quite sympathetic. I got 100 out of her, as a matter of fact. You... Ruth stopped and Victor laughed. His laugh was infectious. She found herself laughing too. That's too bad of you, Mr. Drake. I'm a very accomplished sponger. Highly finished technique. The mater, for instance, will always come across if I send a wire hinting at imminent suicide. You ought to be ashamed of yourself. I disapprove of myself very deeply. I'm a bad lot, Miss Lessing. I'd like you to know just how bad. Why? She was curious. I don't know. You're different. I couldn't play up the usual technique to you. Those clear eyes of yours, you wouldn't fall for it. No, more sin against than sinning, poor fellow. Wouldn't cut any eyes with you. You've no pity in you. Her face hardened. I despise pity. In spite of your name, Ruth is your name, isn't it? Picking that. Ruth the Ruthless. She said, I've no sympathy with weakness. Who said I was weak? No, you're wrong there, my dear. Wicked, perhaps. There's one thing to be said for me. Her lips curled a little. The inevitable excuse. Yes. I enjoy myself, yes, he nodded. I enjoy myself immensely. I've been a good deal alive, Ruth. I've done almost everything. I've been an actor and a storekeeper and a waiter and an odd man and a luggage porter and a property man in a circus. I've sailed before the mast in a tramp steamer. I've been running for president in the South American Republic. I've been in prison. There are only two things I've never done: an honest day's work or paid my own way. He looked at her laughing. She ought, she felt, to have been revolted. But the strength of Victor Drake was the strength of the devil. He could make evil seem amusing. He was looking at her now with that uncanny penetration. You needn't look so smug, Ruth. You haven't as many morals as you think you have. Success is your fetish. You're the kind of girl who ends up by marrying the boss. That's what you ought to have done with George. George oughtn't to have married that little ass Rosemary. He ought to have married you. He'd have been a damn sight better for himself if he had. I think you're rather insulting. Rosemary's a damn fool, always have been. Lovely as paradise and dumb as a rabbit. She's the kind men fall for, but never stick to. Now you're different. My God, if a man fell in love with you, he'd never tire. He had reached a vulnerable spot. She said with sudden raw sincerity, but he wouldn't fall in love with me. You mean George didn't? Don't fool yourself, Ruth. If anything happened to Rosemary, George would marry you like a shot. Victor said, watching her. But you know that as well as I do. Victor said gently, you ought to have more confidence in yourself, my dear girl. You could twist George around your little finger. Rosemary's only a silly little fool. That's true, Ruth thought. If it weren't for Rosemary, I could make George ask me to marry him. I'd be good to him. I'd look after him well. She felt a sudden blind anger, an uprushing of passionate resentment. Victor Drake was watching her with a good deal of amusement. He liked putting ideas into people's heads, or, as in this case, showing them the ideas that were already there. Yes, that was how it started, the chance meeting the man who was going to the other side of the globe on the following day. The Ruth who came back to the office was not quite the same Ruth who had left it, though no one could have noticed anything different in her manner or appearance. Shortly after she had returned to the office, Rosemary Barton rang up the telephone. Mr. Barton has just gone out to lunch. Can I do anything? Oh, Ruth, would you? That tiresome Colonel Race has sent a telegram to say he won't be back in time for my party. Ask George who he'd like to ask instead. We really ought to have another man. There are 4 women. Iris is coming as a treat, and Sandra Faraday, and who on earth's the other? I can't remember. I'm the fourth, I think. You very kindly asked me. Oh, of course, I've forgotten all about you. Rosemary's laugh came light and tingling. She could not see the sudden flush, the hard line of Ruth Lessing's jaw. Ask to Rosemary's party as a favor, a concession to George. Oh yes, we'll have your Ruth Lessing. After all, she'll be pleased to be asked, and she's awfully useful. She looks quite presentable too. In that moment, Ruth Lessing knew that she hated Rosemary Barton. Hated her for being rich and beautiful and careless and brainless. No routine hard work in an office for Rosemary. Everything handed to her on a golden platter. Love affairs, a doting husband, no need to work or plan. Hateful, condescending, stuck-up, frivolous beauty. I wish you were dead, said Ruth Lessing in a low voice to the silent telephone. Her own words startled her. They were so unlike her. She had never been passionate, never vehement, never been anything but cool and controlled and efficient. She said to herself, what's happening to me? She had hated Rosemary Barton that afternoon. She still hated Rosemary Barton on this day a year later. Someday, perhaps, she would be able to forget Rosemary Barton, but not yet. She deliberately sent her mind back to those November days, sitting looking at the telephone, feeling hatred surge up in her heart, giving Rosemary's message to George in her pleasant, controlled voice, suggesting that herself should not come so as to leave the number even. George had quickly overridden that. Coming in to report next morning on the sailing on the San Cristobal, George's relief and gratitude. So he sailed on her, all right? Yes, I handed him the money just before the gangway was taken up, she hesitated and said. He waved his hands as the boat backed away from the quay and called out, love and kisses to George and tell him I'll drink his health tonight. Impudence, said George. He asked curiously, what did you think of him, Ruth? Her voice was deliberately colourless as she replied, oh, much as I expected, a weak type. And George saw nothing, noticed nothing. She felt like crying out, why did you send me to him? Didn't you know what he might do to me? Don't you realize that I'm a different person since yesterday? Can't you see that I'm dangerous? That there's no knowing what I may do? Instead, she said in her businesslike voice, about that San Paulo letter. She was the competent, efficient secretary. 5 more days. Rosemary's birthday. A quiet day at the office, a visit to the hairdresser, the putting on a new black frock, a touch of makeup skillfully applied, a face looking at her in the glass that was not quite her own face, a pale, determined, bitter face. It was true what Victor Drake had said. There was no pity in her. Later, when she was staring across the table at Rosemary Barton's blue confused face, she still felt no pity. Now, 11 months later, thinking of Rosemary Barton, she felt suddenly afraid. 呢一個呢，就係 Ruth Lessing。咁成篇就係成立咗佢嘅殺人動機啦。咁但係佢點樣犯案啊，或者佢係咪真係佢殺啊？呢度就冇講明嘅。但係動機咧，似乎就十分充足啦。咁而慫恿佢犯案嘅咧，咁就陰差陽錯咧，就係 Victor Drake。咁而呢一個 Victor Drake 咧，本身咧就唔係應該係 Ruth Lessing 去處理嘅，本身就應該係 George Barton 去處理嘅。但係因為阿 George 就唔想對住啲咁嘅 low life 啦，咁啊變咗就將呢個工作交咗俾阿 Ruth， 而阿 Ruth in turn 咧就俾呢個 Drake 咧梳擺咗。咁究竟佢有冇真係俾佢梳擺到去殺人咧？呢度咧係冇講清楚嘅，但係咧就似乎係成立咗佢呢個殺人動機啦。咁呢一篇就有幾個字想同大家分享啦。咁就 distrait。distrait 嘅讀音就比較有趣啦，佢係讀 distray， 咁但係串法就係 distrait， 所以就呢個要注意。distrait 嘅意思係 distracted 啦，或者 absent-minded 啦，心不在焉。jackeroo 一個名詞啦，係一個 informal 嘅澳洲名詞，意思係牧場僱用嘅新手。咁呢啲新手咧，當佢儲夠一定累積夠一定職業咧，咁佢就農場嘅擁有者啊，或者一啲喺農場面高級啲嘅職業啦。咁但係一般嚟講 jackeroo 係意思之指農場嘅新手，牧場嘅新手。toreador 啦，都係一個名詞啦。咁係西班牙文啦，西班牙文照 copy 過嚟英文。toreador 係一個 bullfighter。但係咧，佢係喺馬上面嘅，通常都喺馬上 horseback bullfighter， 騎馬鬥士，騎馬鬥牛士。咁我哋下一章節咧，繼續睇下我哋第3個嫌疑犯啦。下一次再見。